Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, welcome back to the podcast. In this solo episode, I want to talk about what to do if your training performance is stalling or getting worse. And I want to start by explaining how to assess whether your performance is actually stalling or getting worse. And I'm very excited to touch on that topic because I discussed it routinely with a lot of clients. And I also have an internal dialogue with myself sometimes because I and many of my clients really love training because of the adrenaline rush that you get when you hit a new PB. And when you get the impression that training isn't going so well, it's easy to get annoyed or upset or to experience another negative emotion about it. However, a lot of people sometimes misinterpret some signs of worsening performance as a stall or a problem in the first place, when it may just be a one-off that they don't really need to worry about. So, first of all, do you need to improve performance over time if you want to grow muscle? Yes, we all know this, and most commonly people will say something along the lines of, you need to create progressive overload in order to see fitness adaptations, whether that's strength or muscle growth. And while that's true, it's also not nuanced enough as a statement, in my opinion. Now, if you want to learn more about progressive overload, I really recommend listening to one of my earliest episodes, an interview with Brian Miner, who is a bodybuilding coach who's been in the game for a really long time. The episode is number 22. It's titled Demystifying Progressive Overload. And in that episode, we agreed, Brian and I, that training performance is likely one of the most valuable ways to assess whether you're actually growing muscle or not. So if over time your training performance is improving, that is likely the best way we have at this moment in time to tell that your muscle mass is increasing. I don't know why it took me so long to think of the word mass there. Anyway, that is a sign that your muscle mass is increasing. However, the important caveat is that it's your performance trend over the long term that's the metric that we're trying to assess here, not a single workout or a couple of workouts over a couple of weeks. And the definition of long term is going to depend on your training experience, because the longer you've been training, following the right approach for muscle growth specifically, the more experienced you're going to be, the slower your gains in terms of muscle growth are going to be. And therefore, your definition of long term is going to cover a much longer period of time than somebody with less training experience. Now, in order for you to get an idea of how long you may have to wait before you can look at your performance trend to assess progress, I like a heuristic that takes into account the speed at which you can realistically see progression. According to this heuristic, which I did discuss with Brian as well, by the way, in episode 22, if you're a beginner, then you can likely see progress almost every workout, assuming the workout is exactly the same. So let's say that you're doing chest and triceps on a Monday and you do it again the next Monday, you're likely going to see progress, if not every single week, almost every week. When you're an intermediate, progress is likely going to occur more on a every other week basis or a training phase to training phase, assuming a 4-week training phase or so. And then when you become advanced, it's going to take maybe a whole training phase or even longer sometimes to see an increase in performance. I want to stress that this is only a heuristic, so it's a simplification of the distinction between beginners, intermediate, and advanced lifters, because advanced covers a lot of people. And the more advanced you become within the advanced category, the slower your gains are going to be. So that's why it's important to understand that this is a very simplified concept. It's there to give you a guideline. It's not set in stone. However, it's still useful because now that you have a better idea of where you fall on this spectrum, let's say that you're an intermediate, then there's no reason to get discouraged if your performance doesn't increase from one workout to the next, because you're no longer a beginner. And from this concept, I want to move on to discussing common misconceptions around training performance and why it may be stalling or regressing. First of all, one bad workout, irrespective of whether you're beginner, intermediate, or advanced, it's not the end of the world. Get over it. You have a bad workout where your performance doesn't improve, even if it was supposed to, based on the heuristic I mentioned, or it even goes down compared to a previous workout. Get over it. It is not a big deal. There's no reason to get discouraged. There's nothing necessarily wrong with your program because it's not a pattern yet. Now, there are several short-term factors that could affect your performance on any given day. It could be the time of day. So if you're training at a very different time of day than usual, your body isn't adapted to that. And that's likely going to affect your performance negatively. If you had a bad night's sleep, it doesn't always happen, but sometimes it can negatively affect your performance. If you're in a really poor mood, or if you're really distracted, or you're dealing with a lot of stress, you have basically everything but training on your mind, your performance is going to take a hit. Not always, but it can happen. Your meal timing and digestion can play a role, whereby if you accidentally ate too close to a workout compared to your normal routine, you might feel way too stuffed and perform a little bit more poorly during the session. Similarly, if on the other hand you ate your last meal further away from training than you normally would, and you go into the session still feeling hungry, well, guess what? Maybe that's going to affect your performance negatively as well. Your energy level at the time that you're supposed to perform is going to play a role. Your menstrual cycle phase is going to make a big difference potentially in your performance if you're one of those people who have significant symptoms in different phases of their menstrual cycles. And you know if you're one of these people. There are some people who go through the entirety of their cycles feeling no different on a day-to-day basis. And there are some people who have a lot more emotional turmoil around PMS, or they feel more tired, or they have more food cravings, or a combination of all of these, and then they experience other symptoms that may be more or less helpful at other phases of their cycle as well. If you're that kind of person, potentially your performance is going to change. Finally, any change in your training program is going to affect your performance, even if you think it's a small change. For example, if you change the order of an exercise within the session, or if you change the session order within the week, it might feel like a small change, but it's still a change that your body now needs to adapt to. So your performance could change slightly while this adaptation occurs. And if that's the case, what I typically tell my clients is to consider your first workouts with the alteration as your new baseline workouts. So then you'd assess your performance against these first workouts instead of comparing the workout to previous sessions that you've already done, because now those sessions belong to an old program. So you only assess your future sessions compared to the new workout where you've made this change. And last but not least, it's important to acknowledge that sometimes you might have a bad workout and you have no idea why. You assess all of these factors that I've talked you through, and you don't think it's any of them, and you still can't perform as well as you expected to. Sometimes this simply happens. However, as I said a couple minutes ago, a single workout really doesn't matter. You only really need to start considering what may be going on if this becomes a pattern. So if over what you would consider a relatively significant period of time, based on your training experience, you see that your performance is stalling or decreasing, then it's worth taking a closer look at what may be going on. And the reason why I use this very complicated verbiage really is that what I'm saying is that having 2 bad workouts in a row for a beginner may be worth looking into, because they're a beginner and they're more likely to see progress, if not every workout, almost every workout. But 2 bad workouts for a more experienced individual may just be a couple of bad workouts, and they're not really anything to particularly worry about, especially if by bad workout you just mean that your performance has stayed the same. Perhaps you might consider what may be going on if performance is decreasing for 2 workouts in a row, but if it's simply stalling and you're more advanced than a beginner, I wouldn't consider that a pattern just yet. That's what I meant when I said that you look into this based on your training experience. Now, if you've established that there is a pattern here and your performance is stalling or decreasing, what can you do? I'm going to go through several scenarios and questions that you want to ask yourself, but I am going to start with an important caveat for people who menstruate. As I've said, if you do experience significant symptoms, it's possible that these symptoms also include alterations in performance across your cycle. So in that case, it doesn't make a lot of sense to compare your training performance week to week, because if not every week, then frequently throughout your cycle, you might see that your performance changes because of your hormonal fluctuations. So I find it a lot more helpful to compare your training performance in a week when you experience the most intense symptoms to the same week in the previous and following cycles. For example, if you get the most intense symptoms during PMS, and your performance is affected, there's no reason to compare PMS to the previous and the following week. It makes a lot more sense to compare your training performance during PMS to the next PMS and the previous PMS. And if there's progress between these 3 occurrences, then you're making progress, even if your PMS week is the worst of the month. It doesn't mean that you need to change your training program if the rest of the time, if compared to previous and following PMS weeks, you're doing better and better. And with that caveat out of the way, let's consider these scenarios and questions. First of all, what if your performance is stalling? So it's not going down, but it's not going up. You're hitting the same number of reps and the same weight every time you go into that session. Now, I wouldn't ask myself these questions in any specific order. And here I am going to start with a question on your intensity of effort, which is, are you actually training hard enough? Are you hitting at least RPE 7, so you're leaving only 3 reps before you hit task failure? And on average, are you hitting around RPE 8, meaning you're leaving 2 reps in reserve before you hit task failure. And I've spoken about RPE and reps in reserve at length. There's episode 9 all about it if you're completely new to the podcast. And if not, you can find plenty of references in a lot of other training related episodes. If you aren't training this hard, then you may not be stimulating your muscles enough to grow. And there may be a number of reasons why you're not doing this right now. Maybe you're chickening out of training hard because it is challenging. Maybe you're being too perfectionistic about your form. I find it often with clients who are very conscientious about their technique. They can get so worried that they're doing every single rep perfectly that as soon as their pinky finger is no longer in perfect alignment, they think that they've hit failure, when that's not the case. You want to certainly have adequate form to stimulate your muscles properly, but form can still be considered adequate even if, when the set gets really hard at the end, your form slips a little bit. It's not exactly as pristine as it was in the initial reps. It's not really meant to be because at the end of the set, you're very, very fatigued. Now, certainly if your first reps look excellent, and if for your final reps, it doesn't even look like you're doing the same exercise anymore, you've gone too far. So you want to strike a balance between being overtly perfectionistic and being way too loose with your form. And the way that you strike the balance is by focusing on this question. Am I still stimulating the muscles with these final reps? Because if you are, even if your form is not perfect, you're fine. But if you feel that you're compensating with other muscles, in that the set feels almost easier towards the end, even if it shouldn't, or it feels just as hard as it did in the beginning, it's likely you're not stimulating the target muscle anymore because now you're distributing the effort across more muscles that you may not want to be training. So then you would consider, maybe I'm getting a little bit too loose with my form. Another reason why you may not be training hard enough is that perhaps you're in a season of life where you're focused on something else. Fitness is not your priority and you're not putting as much effort towards training as you could. And in this case, you may want to accept that right now stalling is the outcome of that, and you'll be able to likely make progress faster again once you can get your head in the game a bit more in a different season of your life, because at the end of the day, every phase in your life is going to be temporary. And if you need to be focusing on something different, that's how things need to be sometimes. The final case in which you may not be putting a lot of effort into training is that perhaps you're psychologically tired of the program, and maybe you're not putting as much focus and or intensity of effort into it because you're bored of it. Now, I would say that as long as a program is working, in that you're progressing, there's no need to change it. And to an extent, you need to accept that a training is effective training, that is repetitive. Changing your program every week or every session isn't effective. Changing your program every month may not be effective either. However, when it stops being effective, because now you're not really working hard towards your sessions, then it would make sense to change something to make it more exciting for you again. So with this, we've covered intensity of effort. Now, another factor to consider is, are you training with enough volume? So the number of weekly direct sets that you perform for a certain body part is your volume. There are other definitions for volume, but as it pertains to muscle growth, this is the definition I personally use. The number of weekly direct sets for a body part or muscle group. And direct means sets of exercises that train the exercise as that muscle as the primary target. For example, a back exercise will train the biceps to an extent, but I personally don't count back exercises towards biceps volume. You can if you want, I just don't. It's just the way I think about it. So all of my back exercises, all of my rows and pull downs go towards my count towards my weekly back volume, my bicep curls count towards my bicep volume. I find that this often happens with beginners who train less often and therefore with less volume, because they don't need more volume than that to make progress. For example, it's relatively common for a beginner to train twice per week and make plenty of progress, sometimes even once per week, and make plenty of progress for a period of time. Now, the more advanced you get, the more volume you're going to need in order to continue making gains. So you may find that your performance stalls simply because the volume that previously was helping you make gains is now enough for you to maintain the gains you've already made, but not to make any more. So in that case, you are going to need to consider upping the volume. And it was very important for me to mention that this is usually applicable to beginners who train with lower volumes, because if you're already training 4, 5, 6 days per week, I don't necessarily think that you need more volume. You might, but I wouldn't say that's the first thing I would think about. I would consider other factors first. Whereas if you're a beginner, you've always trained once or twice per week, and now you're no longer seeing progression or progress performance-wise, then it could be a factor for me to think, hey, maybe now we need to increase this frequency to 3 times per week so that we're getting a bit more volume. And according to the research that I'm familiar with, typically for muscle growth, 10 to 20 sets per muscle group per week is a good range within which to expect to see hypertrophy. Saying that, studies typically only capture group averages. So there are certain outliers, certain individuals, who are going to be able to make progress on as little as 4 to 6 sets for certain muscles, or as many as 20 plus sets. And it's a matter of trial and error, and also trial and error with each individual muscle group, because not every muscle group needs the same amount of volume. All right, so we've covered volume and we've covered intensity of effort. Another factor to consider is your nutritional status. In particular, if you were previously using this program and making progress at a pace that made sense for your training age, and then you were training in a surplus or in at maintenance calories, and now the program is the same, but you've been switching to a deficit and you've been in a deficit for a while, it could make sense for your performance to stall for 2 different reasons. First of all, it may be a false plateau, in that if you've lost weight and your performance stayed the same, your strength relative to your body weight could actually have gone up. Because if you can still do the same reps with the same load, but you weigh less, you're stronger relative to your body weight, so pound for pound or kilogram for kilogram. So always check your strength relative to your body weight to establish whether the plateau is real or perceived. If that's not the case, then you may just be too advanced a lifter to expect visible performance increases while you're in a deficit. And as a rule of thumb, the more aggressive your deficit is, the higher the chances that your performance, the rate at which you progress, will slow down or stall. For example, a mini cut for me is a period of time in which I would undergo the most aggressive deficit that I'm willing to use. And in that case, it's likely that on some exercises, I am going to experience a plateau because I am relatively advanced at this point in time. I've been training regularly and I've been focused on muscle growth for 6 years. Now let's consider the absolute worst case scenario, aka your performance isn't just stalling, it's actually going down, and it's been a pattern for long enough that it's become a real concern for you. It's not just a one-off. The first 3 aspects I always take into account include your lifestyle. So sleep, nutrition, and stress management. How are we doing with these 3 factors? Because if you're not sleeping well and or you're not eating adequately, and or you're not managing your stress and you're just a stress ball all the time, yeah, no wonder your performance is going to go to shit. Now, if you assess these and they are on point or they haven't changed compared to when your performance was increasing at a more reasonable pace, then potentially I would ask, maybe you need a deload, or I would consider whether you need a deload. Because when you train really hard for a certain period of time, you are going to accumulate more and more fatigue. And you may get to a point where you hit your own individual fatigue threshold, at which point your performance stalls. And then if you don't deload, your performance may start going down. So I would try to deload and see if this solves the problem. Signs that you may need a deload, in my experience, include not only a stall or decrease in performance over a period of time, but also mentally, it getting yourself to train becomes a bit of a drag. You're not as motivated as you used to be. You're not as enthusiastic about training as you used to be. You notice that training is affecting your sleep negatively rather than helping it. The right dose of training will help with sleep, but too much fatigue won't. You notice that training is affecting your stress levels. Again, the right dose will help with that. If you need a deload, you'll be more stressed. And also your mood is playing up relative to training. Again, I need to stress it one more time. Mood improves when you get the right dose of training, but if you're in need of a deload, you might see that your mood is a little bit more unpredictable. Now, if a deload doesn't solve the problem, so you go into your first week of training after deloading, I would consider, are you potentially training too much? Whether that's too much volume per week for all of your body parts, or too much intensity of effort to recover from, or a combination of the two. And there are multiple reasons why you might be doing too much of the two or too much of both, of one of the two, I can't talk today. I'm sorry, dear listeners. So there are several reasons why you might be doing too much volume, too much intensity, or a combination of the two. One reason is that maybe you decided to experiment with either higher volume or a higher intensity of effort, or both, and you added too much for you to recover from. Each muscle has a certain recovery threshold in terms of intensity and volume, but also your body as a whole is going to have a certain overall recovery threshold. So maybe your muscles individually can recover from the amount of volume and intensity that you're doing, but when you take them all together across an entire week of training, it's a little bit too much. In that case, you could say that your systemic fatigue is too high. So systemic meaning the fatigue of the whole system is now too high. And that's why when I increase volume for myself or clients, I typically only do so by maybe 10 to 20% on one or two muscles at a time. And then I wait to give the body time to adapt and to see how they're going to respond to that change. And normally 10 to 20% is one or two sets total for the week that you are increasing. And if I increase the set volume, I don't increase the intensity of effort. I only play with one variable at a time. So if on the other hand, I'm increasing the intensity of effort, I'm saying, hey, you've been training at RIR 2, so 2 reps in reserve, or RPE 8. Now we're going to start training to failure. We're keeping volume the same. Again, changing one variable allows the body to adapt a little bit more easily, but also it's easier then to tell what's working and what isn't. If you change too many variables, how would you know? Another scenario in which maybe you're training too much is if you were recovering from this program in the past, but now your life has changed. It's busier and it's more stressful. That means that your recovery capacity is lower than it was before. So even if the training program hasn't changed, you have changed, because we deal with all of the various stressors in our life: work, family, training, all of the other stressors you can think of. We deal with them pulling energy from the same energy store. And when you're running low on that energy, because you're putting it into too many baskets, the training basket is going to be empty. And that's why, even though you haven't changed anything about the program, maybe now it's too much for you. And the final reason why the training program might be too much is that previously, same training program, but also you were in a surplus or you were maintenance calories. And now you've been in a deficit for a relatively long while. You've lost a considerable amount of body fat. And this is especially true if you started already lean and you aimed to get leaner. In that case, it's possible, if you were already lean and you were also intermediate or advanced, that you may be training too much or too hard or a combination of both. And that's why you're no longer recovering, but you can recover from that in a surplus or at maintenance, just not when you're trying to get this lean after a prolonged period of time in a deficit. And I stress the leanness and the level of advancement because if you carry extra body fat, if you're overweight according to the BMI classification, or you have obesity, you have extra stored energy. Your body fat is stored energy. And if on top of that you're a beginner, I also wouldn't be worried about not being able to recover if you're in a deficit. In fact, most beginners who carry this much extra body fat tend to make progress very consistently in a deficit. So I really don't want you to get scared if that's your situation. And the solution to all of these scenarios, if the deload doesn't solve the problem, then you may need to consider pulling back on volume and or intensity, assuming you're not going to change the split and you're not going to change the exercise selection. A final scenario in which you may get the impression that your performance is regressing is if you are, again, too perfectionistic about your technique, to a point where every few weeks you think that your technique is, in quotes, slipping, and you need to, in quotes, improve it. And in order to do so, you drop the weight that you're using back down. So maybe you've been using 80 kilograms for a couple of weeks. All of a sudden, you start panicking that your performance isn't good enough. So you drop it down to 60. You start progressing again, work your way back to 80 kilograms. You panic again, drop back down to 60. You look at this over 3 months and you tell yourself, wow, I keep lifting 60 to 80 kilograms. My performance is not improving. And if anything, it keeps going back down after a period of time where it improves. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that you're overtly stressing over your form. That's what the problem is. And I don't say this from a high horse, by the way. I say this because I was doing it myself. Most of the mistakes that I mentioned were made by me, first and foremost. Now I see them in clients because they're less advanced than I am. But man, have I made all of them? Yes, I have. I used to stress over my technique so freaking much. And I would be the one to progress in weight and reps, and then all of a sudden be like, oh no, I need to drop 10 kilograms because this isn't good enough, because I don't know, a toe fell out of alignment in one rep, and I was like, OMG, now I'm not doing it well enough, I'm not targeting my muscles appropriately. BS. Get over yourself. You're doing it well enough. If you're that conscientious about form, you really don't need to worry. So, having considered all of these scenarios in which performance is stalling or decreasing, I want to flip the conversation on its head and tell you another personal story about my own mistakes to address this scenario. What if you're making progress faster than you'd expect relative to your level of advancement? Personal story time. I used to ego lift a lot. I really like to say to myself, hey, your reps or your weight or both are going up every workout that you do, even if I know that it's unrealistic based on my level of advancement. So even now, it's a little bit hard for me to not ego lift. However, if you are progressing at a really fast rate, I would really question whether you are always using the same technique, or whether maybe you're cutting your range of motion here and there so that it makes it easier and you can do more reps. or whether you are compensating with other muscles or using momentum, because again, it makes it easier so you can do more reps. Because when your performance increases are way faster than you'd expect, maybe it is a little bit too good to be true. And the only other circumstance in which I've personally and with clients encountered a scenario in which your progress is occurring faster than you'd expect, but your training technique is also excellent and there's nothing to worry about in terms of ego lifting, is if you've recently started testosterone, or if you were on testosterone but your testosterone levels were not within the range that they were supposed to be in, and now you've recently increased the dose to increase those levels. So I'm talking primarily to transgender and non-binary, gender diverse people in general who are assigned female at birth and they are on testosterone in order to transition. If that's the case, I personally dubbed that phase a second newbie gains phase, because when your testosterone levels are increasing in the short term, in this initial period of increasing levels, you may find that your performance is getting better faster than you would expect. Enjoy it. It is going to come to an end. That's why I call it the second newbie gains phase. Just like the first one ends, the second one will end as well, typically when your levels stabilize and they then become your new normal. When the new higher levels are no longer new, then you can expect your training performance to return to normal. There is one more scenario actually in which your training performance could improve faster than expected, but not across the entire program. You might find that this happens with one exercise when it's a new exercise or it's one that you've not done for a really long time. And I've covered this in a previous Q&A, so I'm not going to spend too long on this, but basically what you're seeing is called neuromuscular adaptations. Your nervous system is learning to recruit your muscle fibers or muscle cells in the right order, in the right number, and it's learning to send them the right commands to perform this new exercise that you're learning or relearning after a period where you've not done it. So neuromuscular adaptations typically result in faster performance increases that you would expect based on your training experience. And if it's a completely new exercise, these can take up to 10 weeks. So maybe for 6 to 10 weeks, you experience a fast rate of progress, then the neuromuscular adaptations are over, and the rate of progress slows down to match the other exercises. Or if it's an old exercise that you're returning to after a long period of time, it's going to last, the neuromuscular adaptations are going to take less time, and the length of time is going to be relative to how complicated the exercise is. So if you've not done deadlifts in forever, you're likely going to take longer to go through neuromuscular adaptations than if you hadn't done bicep curls in forever. If you're picking up on a bicep curl variation you've not done in a while, I would expect that in the same session, your neuromuscular adaptations will be done and dusted. Whereas with a deadlift, it might take a couple of weeks at least. So in summary, training performance is likely one of the most valuable ways and most reliable ways to assess muscle growth. So it's true that we want to see progressive overload over time to ensure that we are indeed building muscle. However, performance is only useful if you assess your performance trend over the long term. And the definition of long term depends on how advanced you are as a trainee. So if you have one bad workout, get over it, you're absolutely fine. First off, you need to establish that there has actually been a real plateau or a real decrease in performance, and this is a pattern, not a one-off. And then you can go through all the tips that I've given you based on whether you've stalled or actually you've been regressing. And by trial and error, you're likely going to be able to get to the bottom of why it is that performance has stalled or regressed. And hopefully you'll be able to get it right back where you want it to be. With that, that's a wrap for this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you want to work with me as your coach, which I would love to do, or if you want to connect with me, which I would also love to do, because as you can tell, I am very chatty and very friendly, then please use the links in the show notes. And if you can spare a moment to leave a rating or a review, that really helps the podcast grow as well. And it makes my day to know that I impact you in a positive way. With that said, I'm very thankful that you chose to tune in with me today, and I will speak to you in the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.